The hall smelled faintly of roses and polished wood, a scent meant to soothe, but to me, it felt like a weight pressing against my ribs. Golden lights sparkled from chandeliers, catching every crystal on my gown, every shimmer of lace, as if the world had been staged for perfection. Guests shifted in their seats, some smiling warmly, others scanning the program as though my vows were another performance scheduled for the afternoon. My name echoed in whispers, Isabella Carter, the bride of the hour, though to most I had always been only Bella, the younger daughter, the afterthought. I tried to hold my chin high, tried to let the beauty of the moment settle into my bones, but even as the music swelled, my chest tightened with a different kind of anticipation. Maybe, I told myself, maybe today will be different. My parents were seated close to the aisle, their posture impeccable, their faces unreadable. My sister Clara stood not far from them, striking in a crimson gown that clung like armor. Guests murmured at how radiant she looked, a cruel irony given that it was my day. I turned slightly to Daniel, his smile steady, his fingers warm around mine, and I whispered, with all the fragile hope left in me, "Today, maybe they will finally be proud of me." He squeezed my hand in quiet assurance. I wanted to believe him. The officiant cleared his throat. I lifted the microphone to begin the words I had rehearsed 100 times in front of the mirror. My voice should have carried with confidence, but instead it faltered. A pressure pulsed at my temples. The chandeliers above blurred into rings of light. My heart thumped against my ribs, too fast, too irregular. I swallowed hard, forcing out the first line of gratitude to the gathered family and friends. But my breath clipped short, as though the air itself had thinned. I felt the gown tighten, not from the fabric, but from my own body betraying me. A hand reached from somewhere in the front row, someone asking if I was all right. But before I could respond, my knees buckled. The microphone slipped from my fingers, clattering against the marble floor with a hollow crack that silenced the room. In the frozen stillness came the sound of my collapse, the thud of my body against the aisle, a sound so final that several guests gasped aloud. My bouquet scattered petals across the white runner like drops of color on snow. The music halted mid-note. Daniel shouted my name, his voice breaking. Feet scrambled. A woman cried out for help. The crowd became a sea of faces leaning forward, eyes wide, mouths open. I could not answer any of them. The ceiling spun chandeliers, twisting into golden whirlpools. The pressure behind my eyes burned hot. My chest struggled for rhythm. And then the blur of paramedics summoned by the venue, cutting through the chaos with practiced urgency. Cold fingers pressed at my wrist. Orders barked above me. "She is tachycardic. Possible arrhythmia. Move her. Lift her head. Get oxygen." I searched through the blur of bodies for the two faces I craved most. Surely my parents would be rushing down the aisle, pushing aside chairs to reach me. Surely my mother would be kneeling at my side, whispering that it would be all right, my father steadying Daniel with a firm hand. Instead, I saw Clara standing still, arms folded across her perfect gown, her mouth curved into something like a smile. My parents flanked her, whispering to each other with expressions that looked less like fear and more like irritation. My father's jaw was clenched, his lips a thin line. My mother touched her pearls, eyes darting not to me, but to the guests as if gauging their reaction. None of them moved toward me. None of them even called my name. Daniel's hands gripped mine, desperate, his tears falling freely. His voice broke as he pleaded with me to stay awake. The stretcher appeared, and strangers lifted me onto it, their efficiency both comforting and terrifying. As the world tilted and I was carried past the rows of stunned guests, I turned my head enough to see my family. They were not following. They were not even standing. They turned away from the aisle, their backs already shifting toward the reception hall. The last sound I heard from them was not a cry of concern, but Clara's soft laugh as she raised her phone. Hours later, under the sterile hum of hospital machines, I would see what she captured. On my phone screen glowed an image of my parents and Clara standing beneath the archway of the reception hall. They smiled as if the day had gone perfectly. Clara's caption burned into me with the force of a blade. Finally, drama-free. 4 words that erased me entirely. 4 words that announced to everyone watching online that my collapse was not tragedy, but deliverance. They had turned my absence into entertainment. They had celebrated my failure as relief. Comments poured in praising how radiant Clara looked, how fortunate my parents were to have her, how peaceful the event must have been without disruptions. Not a single mention of the bride, not a single note of worry about the daughter carried away in an ambulance before vows could be spoken. The twist hit me harder than the fall itself. It told the truth I had feared my entire life. To them, I was not essential. I was an obstacle. My wedding day, the day meant to affirm my place in this world, had been rewritten as a story of my removal. And the people who should have loved me most had smiled for the camera while the monitors in the hospital beeped my uneven heartbeats into the night. When the hospital lights dimmed and the beeping of the monitors became my only company, the memories started flooding in. They did not arrive gently. They came like old wounds tearing open reminders that what had happened at my wedding was not an isolated cruelty, but the natural continuation of a life shaped by indifference. I saw myself at 14 standing beside a folding table in the middle school gymnasium during the annual science fair. My project had been a papier-mâché volcano carefully built over weeks, painted brown with streaks of red and orange. I had measured the baking soda and vinegar ratio until it erupted on cue. As the judges approached, I pulled the lever and the lava spilled just as planned, fizzing and bubbling with perfect timing. I looked up, hoping for pride in my father's eyes. Gerald gave me a single nod, a motion so slight it could have been mistaken for disinterest, then turned on his heel toward Clara's project 2 tables away. She had built a solar system model, each planet suspended on wires spinning slowly with the aid of a motor she had convinced a teacher to lend her. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights. My father's face transformed into a beam of pride. Colleagues he had invited leaned close and whispered their admiration. He gestured grandly, calling others to see her brilliance. I stood a few feet away, scraping red foam from the tiles while their laughter echoed. Later in the car, the silence was thick until my father finally spoke. "Why can't you apply yourself like your sister?" The words stabbed sharper than any scolding. I pressed my forehead against the cool window glass and said nothing, because what could I have said? That I had worked hard, too. That I had dreamed of him noticing. None of it would have mattered. The pattern repeated itself so often it became the rhythm of my life. At my 16th birthday, I had waited for them to return from Clara's sorority formal. They had promised we would celebrate later. Instead, I came home from school to find a store-bought cake leaning in the fridge and a sticky note on the counter in my mother's handwriting. "We will celebrate next week." Next week never came. I blew out the candles alone, the wax dripping into frosting that tasted of cardboard. Clara, I learned through photos online, had been radiant in her gown, my parents smiling proudly at her side. Even holidays bent around her. Christmas mornings meant Clara at the center, her gifts stacked high, my packages small and perfunctory. Easter services meant photographs of Clara in pastel dresses, while I was somewhere at the edge, cropped out or blurred. In every image, my parents leaned toward her like sunflowers to the sun, leaving me in shadow. I tried to tell myself it did not matter. I threw myself into schoolwork. I joined debate club. I volunteered at the animal shelter. My grades were good, my efforts steady, but achievements that would have meant something to another family were dismissed in ours. When Clara earned an A plus my A was ignored. When Clara won first prize, my second place became invisible. Even the rare moments when I was recognized were stolen. I remember receiving a certificate for community service one year, my photograph taken with the mayor. I brought the clipping home proud to show them. My mother barely glanced before saying Clara was invited to a medical conference in Chicago. Isn't that impressive? And the clipping was lost under a pile of newspapers. By the time I reached senior year of high school, I had stopped hoping. They came to graduation, of course, dressed sharply, cameras ready, but their smiles were not for me. They turned the dinner afterward into a toast for Clara's engagement to Travis, the young medical student with impeccable pedigree. My acceptance letter to a university out west was mentioned only once, followed by my father's disapproving murmur. "That is far from home." I chose it precisely for the distance. I told myself that leaving would mean breathing without comparisons. that across the miles the echoes of Clara's perfection would fade. But even in Denver, the ghost of those comparisons followed. Phone calls from home meant hearing Clara's promotions, Clara's children, Clara's new house, while my own updates drifted like afterthoughts. When I once mentioned securing a $1 million client account at the marketing firm, my father's response was simply, "That's good. Are you dating anyone?" The ache of being invisible settled deep inside me. There were moments when the hunger for recognition became almost unbearable. Watching coworkers hug their parents after promotions, seeing airport reunions with signs and tears, it reminded me of what I had never known. A hand on my shoulder, a voice saying, "We are proud of you." That small phrase never came. Even illness did not bend their indifference. I remembered being 10, fever burning, shivering in my bed. My mother glanced in and said, "Do not make a fuss. Clara has her piano recital." When I cried from the pain in my chest, my father sighed. "Children exaggerate. Clara needs quiet." Those words stitched themselves into my skin. Do not make a fuss. Be quiet. Stay in shadow. Years later, when Clara pushed me during an argument on the stairs and I tumbled down, scraping my arms and knees, my mother dismissed it with, "She is clumsy." Gerald looked at me with disdain and said, "Learn respect the hard way." The bruises faded, but the truth did not. Their love was never unconditional. It was portioned carefully, and Clara always received the larger share. Sitting in that hospital room after my wedding collapse, hearing the monitors trace every fragile beat, I understood that the caption, "finally drama-free," was not new. It was simply the public version of what I had lived all along. My family had always believed I was the drama, the inconvenience, the burden. The wedding only exposed what years of birthdays, competitions, and hospital visits had already proven. That was the real flashback, not a collection of isolated memories, but a single thread running through my life. They had chosen Clara again and again, and every time they chose her, they erased me. Leaving home felt less like a milestone and more like escape. When the acceptance letter arrived from the University of Denver, I folded it carefully and tucked it into my bag before my parents returned from one of Clara's endless ceremonies. I knew if I told them immediately, they would twist it into something smaller, something that mattered less than whatever Clara was achieving that week. When I finally did share the news, my father frowned and asked if there were not good schools closer to home. My mother murmured that distance made families drift. Clara smiled with pity as though I had chosen exile. I smiled back with a steadiness they did not expect because in truth I had chosen freedom. The first weeks in Denver were strange but exhilarating. My apartment was a narrow one-bedroom with chipped tiles and a view of the parking lot, but it was mine. I bought a second-hand couch that sagged and painted the walls a soft gray to cover the stains. For the first time, no one compared my choices to Clara's. No one sighed when I bought cheap flowers at the farmer's market. No one judged my crooked pottery projects from evening classes. Independence tasted sharp like mountain air in winter. It was not glamorous, but it was clean. Still, loneliness crept in at night. Phone calls from home were rare, and when they came, the conversation circled around Clara, Clara's new promotion, Clara's expanding house, Clara's second child. When I tried to share my news, the tone was lukewarm. "That is good," my father said flatly when I explained I had landed an internship at a marketing firm downtown. He asked immediately afterward if I was dating anyone. I pressed the phone against my ear, staring at the bare wall, feeling the weight of being evaluated not for who I was, but for what I lacked. My mother's voice was warmer but distracted. She cataloged Clara's milestones as if reading from a list, and before I could mention mine, she was already saying she needed to hang up. Each call left me hollow. I told myself solitude was better than constant disappointment, but deep down I knew absence could be just as sharp as rejection. At the firm, I discovered a rhythm that kept me afloat. The deadlines were brutal, the late nights endless, but each successful campaign felt like a rebellion against invisibility. When clients signed contracts because of strategies I had built, I tasted something I had never known at home: validation. My supervisor began trusting me with bigger accounts. I stayed long hours, not only because of ambition, but because the office lights kept loneliness at bay. In those fluorescent evenings, I built a kind of chosen family. A few coworkers invited me to trivia nights. Neighbors watered my plants when I traveled. They were not lifelong bonds, but they were chosen, not assigned, and that alone felt liberating. I began routines that became anchors. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market where I splurged on tulips I could barely afford. Quiet evenings in pottery class where my bowls leaned crookedly but no one told me they were failures. Walks through the city streets at dusk when the air felt daring, almost like it challenged me to breathe deeper. Independence gave me strength, but it could not erase the ache completely. At odd moments, it returned sharp and uninvited. Watching a colleague's mother hug her after a promotion, seeing reunions at airports with signs and tears, each scene pierced me with a reminder of what I lacked. That hunger for recognition, for a voice to say we are proud of you, never fully disappeared. I tried to date, but the shadow of my family followed me even there. Early boyfriends grew uncomfortable when I explained that my parents rarely visited, that I was the invisible child. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others pitied me in ways that felt suffocating. I ended relationships quickly, unwilling to replay the dynamics I had fled. When I met Daniel, it was different. He was steady in a way that calmed the storms I carried. A medical resident with long hours, he understood exhaustion, understood what it meant to push yourself even when no one noticed. We met at a friend's gathering, and he listened when I spoke not politely but intently, as though my words carried weight. Over time, his presence became a shield against the echoes of comparison. When he asked me to marry him, it was not with fanfare or spectacle. He knelt in our small living room holding a simple ring and said, "Bella, I want a life where you never have to doubt you matter." Tears blurred my vision because no one had ever said that to me. For a while, I allowed myself to believe marriage could rewrite the story. Perhaps if my parents saw me loved and celebrated, they would finally soften. Perhaps my wedding would be the bridge I had longed for. I invited them with cautious hope. They accepted, but their words carried a distance. "Your sister will help us with the arrangements," my mother said, as if Clara's involvement was the real assurance that things would be done correctly. I tried to ignore the sting. I poured myself into planning every detail, determined that this day would be about me, that I would not vanish into the background. Yet even during fittings, Clara inserted herself, arriving in gowns brighter than mine, critiquing flowers and menus with a tone that echoed our father's judgment. Gerald asked more about the guest list than my happiness. Marilyn focused on how photographs would appear. I swallowed my irritation, telling myself that on the actual day when I walked down the aisle, they would have no choice but to see me. They would have to acknowledge me as a bride, as a woman standing in her own light. I clung to that hope, even as doubt gnawed. In quiet moments, I stared at my reflection and whispered, "They cannot ignore me forever." The truth, though, was that I had built a life far from them because ignoring me was what they did best. And while Denver had given me independence, while Daniel had given me love, the wounds remained raw, ready to split open at the slightest touch. On the morning of the wedding, as I pinned my veil, I whispered again the same fragile plea. Maybe today they will finally be proud. It was a hope that would collapse with me on the floor of the ceremony, proving that some wounds do not fade, they only wait. The morning of the wedding broke with a sky so clear it seemed painted the kind of day brides dream of, but for me, it carried a weight I could not shake. I woke early in the hotel suite, staring at the ceiling while hairstylists and makeup artists prepared their kits. Daniel had texted me a simple message, "I cannot wait to see you at the altar," and that steadiness grounded me. Yet even with his words, my chest carried a tightness that would not ease. When my parents arrived, they did not look at me first. They looked at Clara. She swept into the room in a crimson gown that clung to her frame, sparkling jewels at her ears, hair styled as if she were the bride. Gasps followed her from the bridesmaids. My father smiled at her brilliance. My mother adjusted her necklace, and I stood there in my white gown, feeling like an afterthought on my own day. I forced a smile, reminding myself this was not about them. This was about Daniel and me. I had promised myself I would not let them steal this moment. Guests filled the pews, music rose, and I walked down the aisle with the weight of every eye upon me. I tried to ignore Clara in the front row, glowing like a flame. I tried not to see the way my parents angled toward her, whispering as if she were the main event. My pulse raced, but I smiled, determined to carry myself with dignity. When I reached Daniel, his hands steadied mine, but as I lifted the microphone to speak the words of gratitude, the dizziness surged. The world tilted. My knees buckled. I collapsed. The chaos that followed was a blur of voices and rushing feet. Daniel's shout cracked through the air. Guests stood craning their necks. The music died mid-note. Paramedics were called, pushing through the crowd, their urgent orders slicing through panic. As they lifted me onto a stretcher, I turned my head, desperate to see my family. My father's face was a mask of irritation. My mother's eyes wide, but not with fear. More with embarrassment at the spectacle. Clara's lips curled in a smirk that made my stomach drop. She leaned close to them, whispering, and then she pulled out her phone. While Daniel clutched my hand, begging me to hold on, my family was already preparing to salvage the day by reframing it without me. In the hospital hours later, the truth landed with the cruelty of a blade. Rachel, my friend from college, showed me her phone. On the screen was Clara's post, a picture of her and my parents standing beneath the reception arch, drinks in hand, smiles, polished eyes sparkling. The caption read, "Finally drama-free." The words detonated in my chest. Not only had they abandoned me, they had celebrated it. My absence was their relief. Guests commented on how stunning Clara looked, how fortunate my parents were. No one mentioned me. Not one. The humiliation carved deep. That was the collapse not just of my body, but of the illusion I had clung to. For months leading up to the wedding, I had told myself that maybe this would be the day they saw me. Maybe dressed in white, standing before hundreds, they could no longer deny me. But the moment I fell, they proved what I had always feared. They had no intention of seeing me. To them, I was not a bride. I was the problem finally removed from the picture. The twist stung sharper because it was public. It was not a quiet dismissal behind closed doors. It was broadcast online for relatives, colleagues, neighbors. My pain was their announcement of freedom. I lay in that hospital bed, monitors tracing every uneven heartbeat. Daniel's hand clasped around mine, and I felt as if I had been erased from my own life. Nurses whispered around me, asking if family was on the way. Daniel's eyes flickered with fury when he answered, "No. Only me. Only me." That night, as I drifted between consciousness and exhaustion, the memory of Clara's smirk replayed. The sound of my father's disapproving sigh replayed. The absence of my mother's touch replayed. I had always known I was invisible, but on my wedding day, the truth was no longer hidden. It was undeniable. They had turned me into the villain in a story where I was supposed to be the heroine. The wedding should have been a celebration of love, of commitment, of a future built with Daniel. Instead, it became the perfect symbol of the past I had never escaped. The collapse was not just physical. It was the collapse of years of fragile hope, the final proof that nothing I did would ever be enough to shift their gaze. The fallout extended beyond humiliation. Guests whispered. Some sent texts of sympathy, but even those messages were tinged with disbelief. I heard one coworker had written poor Bella always so dramatic, maybe it was stress. That word followed me like a curse. Drama. It had been used against me since childhood. Do not make a fuss, do not bring drama. And now, even in collapse, it defined me. Yet inside the despair, a small spark ignited. As I stared at the caption on Clara's post, I felt something shift. For years, I had begged silently for recognition. For years, I had bent myself smaller, hoping crumbs of love would fall my way. But lying in that hospital bed, hooked to machines discarded by blood, yet held fiercely by Daniel and Rachel, I understood that the game was over. If their pride would never be mine, then I would no longer chase it. The fallout was brutal, but in that brutality was clarity. The collapse stripped away illusions. It showed me who stood beside me and who turned away. It showed me that the love I sought from them was never coming. And it hinted, though I did not yet know how, that someday I would turn this humiliation into strength. I woke to the steady rhythm of machines, a chorus of beeps that tethered me to consciousness. The ceiling above me was harsh white fluorescent lights buzzing faintly like angry insects. My throat was dry, my chest heavy, and for a moment I could not remember where I was. Then the smell of antiseptic hit me sharp and sterile, and it came rushing back. The wedding, the collapse, the stretcher. I turned my head and saw Daniel slumped in the chair beside me, his hand still wrapped around mine even in sleep. His eyes were red-rimmed, his suit wrinkled from hours of vigil. A wave of gratitude washed over me so powerful it brought tears to my eyes. He had not let go. A nurse entered, checking my IV, adjusting the monitor, her movements efficient. She offered a kind smile and said gently, "You gave everyone a scare. We ran tests. Your heart rhythm was unstable, severe exhaustion with signs of arrhythmia. We will monitor closely." Then she hesitated. "We called your parents. They said they would come." She glanced toward the door as if expecting them to arrive at any moment, but the doorway remained empty. Hours later, it was still empty. By the time the sun dipped behind the city skyline, painting the window in copper light, no familiar face had appeared. No mother smoothing my hair. No father gripping my hand. Only Daniel and eventually Rachel, who burst into the room with a tote bag full of pajamas and my phone charger. She set them on the table and pulled me into a careful hug, whispering, "I am not going anywhere." My relief broke into sobs I could not control. She had been my college roommate, not family, yet she was here when family was not. After the nurse left, Rachel handed me my phone. Notifications glowed across the screen, dozens of them. For one fragile moment, I thought perhaps they were from my parents apologizing, frantic with worry. My thumb hovered, heart thumping, but when I opened them, the top notification was from Clara. She had tagged me in her post. The image filled the screen, polished smiles, my parents radiant beside her under the reception arch, glasses raised. The caption read, "Finally drama-free." I stared until the words blurred. My breath hitched. Daniel leaned closer, saw it, and swore under his breath. Rachel's eyes blazed with fury. They knew what it meant. They knew this was not only neglect, it was mockery. It was the public declaration that my collapse had been a gift to them. I pressed the phone face down on the tray table as though it burned. For years, I had told myself that maybe I was too sensitive, that maybe their favoritism was unintentional, but the caption carved that lie apart. It was intentional. It was cruel. And it was celebrated. My body ached, but my mind raced. How many people had seen it already? How many relatives would nod along, thinking, yes, Clara is the good daughter, Bella is the drama? The humiliation settled like lead in my stomach. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting machines, but inside me, something darker was unraveling. I kept glancing at the door, each set of footsteps raising a spark of hope, only for it to die when strangers passed by. Morning turned into afternoon, afternoon into night. Still, no one came. Not my father, not my mother, not Clara. I wanted to believe flights were delayed, schedules tangled, but the truth was clear. They had chosen not to come. The monitors kept their rhythm indifferent to my heartbreak. Daniel leaned forward, taking my face in his hands. "Bella, listen to me. You did nothing wrong. Do you understand? This is not your fault." His voice cracked. I nodded, but inside, a war raged. Part of me wanted to collapse deeper into despair. Part of me felt anger like I had never known. It was not only about the wedding. It was about every moment before it. The volcano project ignored. The birthdays forgotten. The illnesses dismissed. This was the culmination, not the exception. And finally, there in the hospital bed, I understood. If collapsing in front of hundreds on the most important day of my life did not bring them to me, nothing ever would. The clarity was brutal but clean. A nurse named Jordan came in during the night shift, adjusting my IV, humming softly. She noticed the empty chairs and said with quiet compassion, "You would be surprised how many patients go through serious procedures alone. But here is the thing. Staff becomes family in places like this. We have your back." Her words landed deeper than she knew. Family. The word had always felt poisoned to me, bound to disappointment. But hearing it offered without conditions from a stranger was like a foreign language I wanted to learn. Rachel sat beside me, scrolling through news feeds, shaking her head at Clara's growing list of comments. She leaned over and whispered, "They want the world to think you are drama. Do not give them the satisfaction. We will figure out a way to show the truth." Her loyalty steadied me. Daniel, exhausted, refused to leave my side. Together, they formed a circle of protection that my blood relatives never had. The tests continued. An MRI confirmed the arrhythmia was stress-induced, a warning that my body had reached its limit. Surgery was mentioned as a possibility if things worsened. Instead of fear, I felt a strange emptiness. I was not afraid of the hospital. I was afraid of the silence in the waiting room, the knowledge that my parents would not be there. Days blurred. The drip of fluids, the shuffle of nurses, the cold meals. Through it all, my phone remained silent. No apology, no concern, no explanation. Just the echo of that caption. Finally, drama-free. The truth cut sharper than scalpels. I realized I had begged for recognition my entire life. I had bent myself into silence, into effort, into excellence, hoping one day they would see me. But in that bed, watching Daniel doze in a chair, Rachel scrolling fiercely, Jordan checking vitals, I saw the truth. The people who should have shown up never would. The people who had no obligation had become my family instead. And for the first time through exhaustion and heartbreak, I allowed myself to think that maybe, just maybe, blood was not the bond that mattered most. The quiet of the hospital nights left too much room for memory. Each time the machines beeped in steady rhythm, I found myself slipping back not into dreams, but into scenes I had spent years trying to bury. They rose sharp and vivid as if my body finally demanded I acknowledge the truth of how long the violence and control had shaped me. I was 14 again, standing in the kitchen with a plate still in my hand. Gerald towered over me, his voice booming through the walls. I had spoken back just once when he dismissed my questions about school. The sting of his palm across my cheek came fast, shocking more than painful, but the words that followed etched deeper. A daughter must learn respect the hard way. My face burned, my throat closed, and I remembered how my mother simply set down her teacup and said nothing. The silence was permission. The silence was complicity. At 10 years old, I had lain in bed with a fever that burned like fire in my chest. Clara practiced piano in the next room, each note crisp. Each mistake met with gentle encouragement from my mother. I whispered that I felt too weak, that I needed help. My mother glanced in, her voice sharp with irritation. "Do not make a fuss. Clara has her recital tomorrow." I curled smaller beneath the blanket, shame heavier than illness. That phrase would become the refrain of my childhood. Do not make a fuss. Be quiet. Stay out of the way. At 16, Clara and I argued in the hallway about a borrowed sweater. She shoved me hard, and I stumbled backward down the stairs, scraping my arms against the banister knees, bruising on the wooden steps. I cried out not just from pain, but from disbelief that she would go that far. My mother rushed over, but instead of anger at Clara, she tutted, "She is clumsy, always has been." My father glared down at me and muttered, "Learn to keep your mouth shut." The bruises faded, but the lesson was permanent. Speak up and you will be punished. Stay silent and you will be forgotten. Even as I grew older, the control threaded through every part of my life. When I applied to colleges, my father reviewed my essays not with pride, but with disdain. He insisted I consider schools near home. When I received my acceptance letter to Denver, his reaction was cold. "That is far from home," he said, as though distance was betrayal. When I protested, he raised his voice until my mother intervened, but not to defend me. She urged me to reconsider, telling me that independence was selfish. Clara, meanwhile, was praised for every ambition, every achievement, no matter how distant. Their control was selective. It bound me tightly while giving her wings. I remembered sitting at the dinner table one night when Clara announced she had been invited to a prestigious internship. My parents erupted in applause, toasting her with sparkling cider. When I quietly mentioned that I had been accepted into debate club leadership, my father sneered. "That will not get you anywhere." The dismissal crushed me more than any blow. Words were their own kind of violence. They sliced at self-worth until only scraps remained. My mother's gaslighting became a constant undercurrent. When I cried after being ignored, she accused me of exaggeration. When I sought comfort, she insisted I was too sensitive. Her favorite phrase was, "You always make things bigger than they are." Over time, I questioned my own reality. Was I really being neglected, or was I imagining it? That confusion was as damaging as any physical wound. Yet the darkest memory came years later when Clara's temper flared again. We were adults by then. I had returned for a holiday. Tension simmered, as always, my parents doting on her children while barely acknowledging my presence. I confronted Clara privately, telling her she had humiliated me with a cruel remark in front of relatives. Her eyes narrowed and she stepped closer, whispering, "You were born to be less." Then she shoved me against the wall hard enough to rattle the picture frames. I gasped, but when I told my parents, their response was chilling. My father's eyes hardened and he said coldly, "You provoke her." My mother shook her head, adding, "Clara has enough stress without your constant complaints." Their refusal to protect me felt like a second blow. Lying in the hospital bed years later, these memories formed a chain linking every instance of neglect, every act of control. The collapse at my wedding was not random. It was the culmination of decades of being silenced and diminished. The arrhythmia, the exhaustion, the breakdown of my body were simply physical expressions of wounds I had carried since childhood. Each beat of the monitor echoed those old refrains. Do not make a fuss. Learn the hard way. Stay silent. But within the pain, another feeling rose: anger. For so long, I had internalized their narrative, believing I was the problem, the drama. Now, staring at the reality of Clara's caption, "Finally drama-free," I realized the truth. They had used violence and control to keep me small. They had gaslighted me into doubting myself. They had celebrated my erasure. And yet, despite it all, I was still here, alive, breathing, my heart unstable but still beating. That realization sparked something new, a refusal to stay silent. The memories hurt, but they also clarified. This was not my fault. This was their failure. And for the first time in years, I began to consider what it would mean to fight back, not with fists or shouting, but with truth. The days after the collapse bled into one another, each marked by the hiss of oxygen, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the gentle hum of machines that kept me tethered to the world. My body was fragile, but my mind churned with a relentless storm. For so long, I had been the quiet one, the one who endured, the one who believed that maybe next time my family would choose me. But the wedding stripped away the last illusion. They had not only ignored me, they had mocked me publicly. Clara's caption had become a scar across my name. Finally, drama-free. It echoed in my head each time the monitor beeped. I could not let that stand. Not anymore. One evening, Rachel came by after work, dropping her coat on the chair and pulling out her laptop. She looked at me with the fierceness of someone who had decided enough was enough. "Bella," she said, "you do not have to accept this narrative. They want the world to think you are weak, dramatic, disposable. We can prove otherwise." Her conviction startled me. How I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She opened a folder on her computer and turned the screen toward me. Screenshots of Clara's post. Comments praising her while erasing me. The photo of my parents smiling beneath the reception arch. "We start here," Rachel said, "and we gather more. You know the truth. We just need to show it." For years, I had collected fragments without realizing it. Journals filled with entries about neglect, small photographs where I was cropped out text messages where my parents dismissed me in favor of Clara. Even recordings from phone calls where their voices carried disdain. At the time, I had saved them almost as proof to myself that I was not imagining it. Now, under Rachel's guidance, those fragments became ammunition. We spent hours going through my phone, my old files, my social media. Each piece was like a puzzle clicking into place. A birthday message from my mother that read simply, "Sorry we could not make it. Clara had an event." A voicemail from my father chastising me for moving so far away while praising Clara's new home. Photographs where Clara stood center stage, my parents glowing at her side while I hovered at the edge unnoticed. Daniel joined us, his jaw tight as he listened to recordings, his hand steady on my shoulder. Bella, he said softly, this is not just about your wedding. This is years of erasure, and people need to know. At first, fear gripped me. If I exposed them, what would happen? They were respected in our community. My father's architectural firm carried influence. My mother was beloved by her students. Clara had built a pristine reputation in public relations. Would anyone believe me, or would I be painted as the bitter younger daughter seeking revenge? Rachel must have read my thoughts because she leaned closer and said, truth is your weapon. Not exaggeration, not rage, just truth. They cannot twist what is undeniable. Her words ignited something inside me. For years, truth had been my silent companion, written in journals no one read, spoken into pillows at night. Now it could become my defense. I agreed. We began organizing the evidence into a timeline. Childhood neglect, teenage humiliation, adult dismissal, and finally the wedding collapse and the post that crowned it all. The pattern was undeniable. As the files grew, so did my resolve. Each screenshot was a memory I no longer had to carry alone. Each recording was a voice that betrayed them, not me. Yet with resolve came waves of doubt. Late at night, when the hospital was quiet, I would stare at the ceiling and hear my mother's voice. You always make things bigger than they are. Was I? The question clawed at me. But then I would remember the sting of my father's hand, the shove from Clara, the sticky note that replaced a birthday. I would remember the photo of my family smiling while I lay unconscious. No, I whispered to myself. I am not making this bigger. They did this. They chose this. And they need to face it. My first act of resistance was small but felt monumental. I posted a photograph of myself in the hospital bed, IV taped to my arm, Daniel and Rachel at my side. The caption read simply, "Grateful for those who show up when it matters." I did not mention my family. I did not need to. The silence around them was louder than any accusation. The post gained quiet traction. Colleagues left comments of support. Former classmates messaged me privately, some admitting they had noticed the favoritism years ago. One wrote, "I always wondered why you seemed left out of photos." I am sorry. Their validation steadied me. For the first time, my narrative was not only mine, it was being seen. My parents did not respond publicly, but Clara sent a message to my phone. It was short. "You are making this worse for yourself. Stop!" The threat was veiled but clear. Instead of fear, I felt clarity. She knew the truth threatened her image, and that meant I was finally taking power back. Rachel and I continued gathering. We created a folder labeled Evidence. Inside were years of silence, dismissals, cruelty. For so long, those moments had been private shame. Now they were proof. Proof that I was not imagining things. Proof that my family had built their reputation on erasing me. Each click of the mouse, each saved file felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Daniel reminded me to rest, to focus on healing, but even he admitted that the process was healing in its own way. "Bella," he said, "you are taking control, not with anger, but with facts, and that is stronger than anything they can throw at you." One evening, as Rachel packed up her laptop, she looked at me and said, "You know, this cannot just stay in a folder. One day, you will have to show them, show everyone." The thought terrified me, but also filled me with a strange anticipation. For years, confrontation had been my greatest fear, but maybe, just maybe, it was the only path to freedom. As I lay back, the monitor tracing each fragile beat, I realized that resistance did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it was simply refusing to be silenced any longer. And I had taken the first step. The invitation arrived as a phone call from my father, his voice tight, every word coded in urgency and calculation. "We need to meet Bella. Your collapse created too much gossip. People are asking questions. Your mother and I think it would be wise to have a family dinner, clear the air, show unity." His tone was not concern. It was damage control. I almost hung up, but Rachel pressed her hand over mine and whispered, "This could be the moment. You have the truth. Do not hide it." So I agreed, my stomach twisting with equal parts fear and anticipation. The dinner was held at an upscale restaurant, the kind with linen-draped tables and crystal glasses that sparkled under soft lighting. I arrived with Daniel and Rachel, my hands trembling despite their steady presence at my side. Inside, I saw them already seated. Gerald with his usual air of command, Marilyn clutching her pearls, Clara radiant in another crimson dress that screamed for attention. And beside them, frail but upright, was my grandfather William. He had insisted on coming despite his failing health. The sight of him brought tears to my eyes. He was the only one who had ever seen me without comparison, the only one who called me his clever girl. His presence gave me courage. I took my seat opposite them, feeling the tension hum through the tablecloth like electricity. My father cleared his throat. "Bella, we are here to put this unpleasantness behind us. People are talking about the wedding. It reflects poorly on the family." My mother nodded, eyes darting nervously. Clara leaned back with her glass of wine, a smirk playing at her lips. She spoke before I could. "You have always loved making a scene. Posting from the hospital was unnecessary. It only confirmed what people already think, that you thrive on drama." The word slammed into me, familiar as a curse. Drama. I felt the old urge to shrink to apologize, but Rachel's hand squeezed mine under the table. Daniel's gaze anchored me. I reached into my bag, pulled out a small USB drive, and set it on the table. My father frowned. "What is that?" "Evidence," I said, my voice steady, though my heart pounded. Rachel leaned forward and plugged the drive into the restaurant's projector system we had arranged ahead of time. The screen on the wall flickered to life. First came Clara's post, the photograph of her and my parents smiling beneath the reception arch. The caption burned across the screen. "Finally, drama-free." Gasps rose from nearby tables as diners glanced over curious. My father's face paled. My mother pressed her hand to her mouth. Clara shifted uncomfortably but tried to maintain her smirk. "That is taken out of context," she said quickly. I raised my voice louder now, carrying across the room. "Context. The context is that while I lay in the hospital unconscious, you celebrated. The context is years of being erased, dismissed, belittled." Another slide appeared. Screenshots of text messages where my parents canceled my birthdays for Clara's events. A voicemail of my father dismissing my achievements. A photo where I stood cropped at the edge while Clara shone in the center. The pattern unfolded like a case file, undeniable. My father slammed his hand on the table. "Enough! You are humiliating us." My voice shook, but I pressed forward. "Humiliation. Do you know what humiliation is? It is collapsing at your own wedding and waking up to see your family smile for cameras without you. It is hearing your own sister call your absence a blessing. It is being invisible in your own home since childhood." The room had gone quiet except for the faint clinking of glasses. Other diners watched openly now. My mother whispered through tears. "We did not think it was so serious." I snapped back. "The hospital called you. You knew, and you still chose to smile for a photograph." Clara finally broke her voice sharp. "You always twist things. You cannot stand that I succeed." I cut her off, my voice rising with years of pent-up fury. "This is not about your success. This is about your cruelty, about parents who failed to love both their daughters equally, about a family that silenced one child to glorify another." The emotional undulation peaked as I turned to my grandfather. His eyes glistened, his frail hand trembling on the table. He struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. His voice cracked, but carried a weight that silenced even Gerald. "For years, I have watched this family give everything to Clara while Bella stood invisible. I kept quiet because I thought it was not my place. But I am dying, so I will say it now. You failed her, not once, but again, and again." The words landed heavier than anything I could have said. My father tried to protest, but Grandpa William fixed him with a glare that even illness could not dull. "Do not speak," he rasped. "You have had a lifetime to defend your actions. Tonight the truth stands on its own." Tears blurred my vision as I whispered, "I do not need apologies. I need change. I need to matter even when it is inconvenient." For the first time in my life, my parents did not look defensive. They looked small. My mother's cheeks glistened with tears. My father stared at the tablecloth as if it might swallow him. Clara turned away, her smirk gone, her face pale. The silence was thick, broken only when my grandfather reached across the table, his hand shaking as he touched mine. Bella, stop running from them. Say your truth, then decide. Running only keeps their power alive. I nodded my chest, heaving my heart pounding against the monitor in my memory. I looked at them, all the people who had shaped my pain, and for the first time I spoke without fear. I am not invisible. Not anymore. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with clarity. I had exposed them, in public, with evidence, with truth, and though the fallout was still to come in that moment, the power shifted. They could no longer pretend. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. The fallout began almost immediately after that dinner. The restaurant confrontation had not been private. Diners had filmed on their phones, snippets of Clara's post projected on the wall, my words trembling, but sharp, my grandfather's declaration slicing through the air. Within hours, clips circulated online. At first, it was whispers in community forums, then local news picked it up. Architect Gerald Carter humiliated in public confrontation with daughter. Beloved teacher Marilyn Carter caught ignoring hospitalized child. Public relations executive Clara Carter accused of cruelty. The headlines multiplied, each echoing the truth I had laid bare. My phone buzzed constantly, messages from colleagues, acquaintances, even strangers who had once only known me through work. Some offered sympathy. Others expressed outrage. One wrote, "I always admired your professionalism, but I never knew what you endured. I stand with you." Another said, "I had Mrs. Carter as a teacher. I am shocked, but I believe you." The validation was overwhelming and terrifying. My father tried to control the narrative at first. He issued a statement through his firm, insisting it was a family misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But the video of him slamming his hand on the table while evidence played behind him contradicted every word. Clients began withdrawing contracts. Within weeks, his prestigious architectural projects were suspended. Whispers of investigation into workplace bullying surfaced, former employees emboldened to share their own stories. The man who had always strutted with certainty now faced suspension and financial strain. My mother fared no better. The school board placed her on leave pending review after parents demanded answers. How could a woman trusted with children show such disregard for her own? Former students shared memories online, some defending her, others admitting they had sensed her favoritism even in the classroom. Her carefully cultivated image of patience cracked under scrutiny. Clara's downfall came swiftly. In public relations, reputation is everything, and the viral clips destroyed hers. Companies canceled campaigns under her management, unwilling to be associated with the cruelty etched in her caption. Finally, drama-free became a hashtag, but not in her favor. Memes spread using her words to highlight toxic families, abusive dynamics, parental neglect. She tried to backpedal, claiming the post was misinterpreted, but screenshots were undeniable. Even her husband Travis distanced himself, appearing at events alone, his career at a hospital jeopardized by association. For years, Clara had been the untouchable star, but now the spotlight seared instead of flattered. As their facades crumbled, my own world shifted. For the first time, I was not invisible. People reached out with support, survivors of similar families sharing their stories, thanking me for speaking truth publicly. My small act of resistance had become a wave. Daniel stood by me unwaveringly. Rachel managed the flood of attention, helping filter messages, ensuring I saw the supportive ones instead of the cruel. Because cruelty came too. Some accused me of seeking revenge, of exploiting private matters. I had expected that, but each time doubt clawed at me, I returned to the evidence. I had not fabricated. I had revealed, and the consequences were theirs, not mine. The emotional undulation was fierce. Some mornings I woke with hope, seeing justice unfold. Other nights I shook with fear, wondering if I had destroyed too much, if I had become what they accused me of. Daniel reminded me gently. They destroyed themselves. You only held up the mirror. My grandfather, William, called me from his hospital bed, his voice weak but steady. Bella, you did what I never had the courage to. You told the truth, and you freed yourself. Tears stung my eyes as I thanked him, knowing time was short. Weeks later, he passed quietly, his hand in mine. The grief was sharp, but unlike the grief of my parents' betrayal, it was clean. He had given me clarity in his final months. The will revealed he had left me the cabin by the lake, the place of our childhood summers. It became my sanctuary for recovery, a symbol of his belief in me. Meanwhile, my parents tried reaching out awkward visits, hesitant calls, each attempt clumsy. Sometimes they begged for forgiveness, other times they lashed out defensively. I listened, but no longer bent myself into their shape. I did not slam the door, but I no longer waited at the window. The power had shifted. They could no longer erase me. The community saw the truth, and while their reputations unraveled, I began to rebuild. I spoke at a local support group for survivors of family neglect and abuse. I shared my story, carefully aware of the audience's age, aware that many carried their own hidden scars. The room responded with nods, tears whispered thank yous. For the first time, my voice mattered not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Clara, stripped of contracts, retreated from public view. My father faced lawsuits from former employees. My mother's teaching license hung in limbo. Each consequence was a brick in the wall of accountability long overdue. And though a part of me still ached with the longing for what might have been a stronger part understood, justice was never going to look like their embrace. Justice looked like truth-revealed consequences faced freedom earned. As I stood on the dock of the cabin one evening, the water reflecting a fiery sunset, I whispered into the air, "This is the family I choose. Not the one that abandoned me, but the one that carried me when I fell." Daniel wrapped his arms around me from behind. Rachel waved from the porch, laughing at something on her phone. They were my family now, and the world finally knew that the Carters' perfect image had always been built on a lie. The first time I stepped into the cabin by the lake after my grandfather's passing, the air smelled of pine and memory. Dust motes floated in shafts of sunlight cutting through the windows, and the floor creaked beneath my feet in the same rhythm I remembered from childhood summers. For a moment, grief threatened to choke me. He was gone, the one person who had always called me his clever girl, the one who had believed in me without condition. But as I walked to the window and looked out at the water stretching calm and endless, I felt his presence. This was his final gift to me, a place not of shadows but of sanctuary. Daniel and I spent weeks repairing the cabin, sanding the porch, painting the walls, clearing the garden overgrown with weeds. Rachel visited often, arms full of food, laughter filling the rooms that once held silence. Slowly the space transformed from relic to refuge. Each sunset over the lake felt like a balm, each loon call across the water a reminder that I was not invisible. I had survived, I had spoken, and now I had to decide how to live in the aftermath. My parents and Clara tried again to contact me. Sometimes they arrived at the cabin unannounced, standing on the porch with hesitant expressions, words of apology trembling on their lips. Other times they called with defensive tones, insisting the fallout had gone too far, begging me to make statements to ease their reputations. I listened, but I no longer bent myself into their shape. Their attempts were clumsy and inconsistent, and though a part of me wished for reconciliation, I knew better. Healing did not mean returning to what had broken me. Healing meant building something new. With Rachel's encouragement, I began attending a support group at a community center in town. The first night I walked in my chest tight with nerves, but as I listened to others share their stories of neglect, favoritism, silence, I felt less alone. When it was my turn, my voice shook, but I spoke. I told them about the collapse at my wedding, about the caption that cut me open about years of being the forgotten child. The room was quiet as I finished, then filled with nods and soft words of solidarity. One older woman pressed my hand and said, "You gave me the courage to tell my story." In that moment, I realized my pain could be more than a wound. It could be a bridge. Word spread, and soon I was invited to speak at other gatherings, then at a local college. Each time I told my story, the fear lessened and the power grew. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer drama. I was simply human telling the truth. Daniel stood by me through it all, his steady presence, the anchor I had dreamed of as a child. One evening on the dock, as the sun sank low and the water blazed gold, he wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "You are not just surviving, Bella. You are leading." The words made me cry, not from sadness, but from release. For so long, I had begged for my parents to say they were proud. Now I no longer needed it. I had people who showed up, people who carried me when I fell, people who proved that family is not only blood, family is choice. Rachel and I began working with others from the support group to create a small foundation offering resources for those dealing with toxic families. We hosted workshops, shared stories, raised funds. The cabin became a gathering place. Laughter echoing through the trees, hope replacing silence. Sometimes at night, I stood on the dock alone, looking up at the stars, and whispered to my grandfather, "I hope I am making you proud." The wind off the lake would brush against my face, and I chose to believe it was his answer. Meanwhile, my parents and Clara faced ongoing consequences. Gerald's firm never recovered. Marilyn retired quietly, her license suspended. Clara retreated from public life, her reputation irreparably damaged. They lived in the same town, but we inhabited different worlds. On rare occasions, I answered their calls, but I set boundaries they could not cross. If they wanted to change, it would be on them. I no longer measured myself against their approval. The emotional undulation of my journey had brought me here: collapse, despair, confrontation, consequence, and now healing. Not perfect, not painless, but real. One evening, as the sky bled into twilight, I sat with Daniel and Rachel on the dock. We watched the water ripple with light, and I said quietly, "Family is not always who raises you. It is who carries you when you collapse, who sits beside your bed when fear is thick, who proves you are worth showing up for. That is the family I choose." Daniel kissed my temple. Rachel squeezed my hand. The peace that settled over me was deeper than anything I had known in childhood. I had lost illusions but gained truth, and in that truth I found freedom.